FDA approval has a lot of power behind it, and there's no respect in the medical industry if any drug or medical device does not have FDA approval. It's the first thing that people ask, is it FDA approved?
We have a lot of faith in that. You know, there was a study that was done that looked at people on the internet, about 4,300 people on the internet, and what they found is that 40% of the people believe that the FDA approved only very safe and effective drugs. And it's hardly the case. And we'll get into that.
So can we trust the FDA?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we recently talked about the FDA and its relationship to Big Pharma and how it compromises the safety of medicines. Now, with pharmaceutical drugs, the third most common cause of U.S. deaths, that's really something to be thinking about.
That's right.
Yeah, well, there's a new study now that's published in JAMA, that's the Journal of American Medical Association, that looks at the criteria used by the FDA in approving new drugs and medical devices that's worrisome. So tell us more about the study and what it is revealing about FDA practices.
Right. Well, this was a study that came out of Yale University School of Medicine. And what they did is they looked at all the studies that were done on drugs between the year 2005 and 2012. So they had 188 different drugs and technologies that they reviewed. And what they found was, in this study, is that there were only an average of about 2 studies. Most of the time, there were only about 2 studies. And about 30% of the time, there was only 1 study that characterized whether or not they were going to be able to approve this drug. Now, they call that having flexibility. What I call that is having a lot of power to make important decisions that are going to determine whether or not you're going to be using these drugs if you're sick.
Well, they also interviewed doctors and patients and found out that people thought that when drugs were approved, that they had very few side effects and that they were effective.
Yeah, right. Well,
they just assumed that. But the studies don't have any criteria. They're just like all over the places. Some of them, they do study them. Some of them, the studies are vague, and some of them, they just rush them through.
Well, there's a whole thing going on where the pharmaceutical industry has a spot on most of the committees, and about 20% of the time, or not 20% of the time, most of the time, the 20% of the people on the panel who are voting are experts from the pharmaceutical industry. You'd have to say you like the idea of having that there because these people know a lot about the drug. But the problem is have a conflict of interest. And how often
Big time.
Yeah, well, how often do you see a pharmaceutical representative on a committee voting against their drug? Could you imagine what would happen to them if they went back to work on Monday and said, well, we did the right thing. I voted against the drug we just spent $500 million on. I think they'd be toast.
Yeah, I'll say. Maybe with a little jam on it.
Yeah, maybe so.
Well, there's a lot of risks, and they're supposed to be collecting data on the risks of the drugs really throughout the life of the drug, but they don't even do that anyway.
Well, some of the time they do, but you're right. Most of the time they sure don't, and they don't feel pressure to do it because the FDA isn't forcing it. You have to keep in mind that when a drug comes to market, what happens is that drug is still going through a lot of review of whether or not it's safe and effective, especially if a drug is fast-tracked. You know, a lot of the time, Vicki, they have these committees that will get a drug approved in a much shorter period of time because they think maybe it's urgent to get that particular drug on the market.
And they say it likely has benefits.
Well, yeah. Well, somebody has cancer, they want to have some kind of treatment for it, but most of the time what turns out is these drugs are fast-tracked through. They pay millions of dollars for each drug to the FDA for that, so it sets up a stage where there's a clear conflict of interest between the FDA and the pharmaceutical company because the FDA gets that money and they depend on it then to do the things that they do to pay their bills.
The other thing is that drugs for chronic diseases, the trials for those drugs, they're only done for a year.
Or a lot of the time less than a year.
This is for a chronic disease that a person is going to be taking this drug for the rest of their life.
Right. There are no long-term studies relatively that I know of for conditions like heart disease or hypertension or diabetes where we're looking at safety over a 10 or 20-year period. It just isn't done.
And what about drugs being compared to drugs that already exist?
So what Vicky's talking about is we don't do comparative studies where we look at all the different diuretics, for example, if they are, and see what kind of an effect they have in lowering blood pressure, or some of the different drugs that are in a certain family of drugs, like the ACE inhibitors, or in other situations like that. There are no head-to-head studies because Big Pharma doesn't want to do that. Why would they? Because only one drug is going to come out on top, and if there are 10 or 15 drugs in the study, 14 are going to be losers. So the odds are, why do it? Now, with Obamacare, it may be that there's going to be a little bit more in the way of comparative studies, because that was one of the big things that President Obama wanted to do, but that's yet to be seen.
Well, also, only 20% of FDA-approved drugs
Say it another way.
Okay, 20% of FDA-approved drugs are either put a black box warning on them or they're taken off the market.
Yeah, within a couple of years. So that tells you that 1 in 5 drugs, 20% of the time, is a drug that shouldn't be on the market, but it got either fast-tracked or it was only had a few studies that were done that showed that this was something that might be useful. Is that what you want your FDA to do? You wonder if you can trust even the literature that's published by these big, giant pharmaceutical companies or technology companies. And that's why people like Marcia Angel, who was the chief editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, and Catherine DeAngelis, who is the chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and Ushma Neal from the Journal of Clinical Investigation, have all come out stating that a lot of the information that's getting published in their journals has conflicts of interest that make them unreliable. And when you're in the ICU or you're in the CCU and your good doctor is depending on the literature to determine what to do for you, you may be sadly disappointed to know that a lot of the time those are drugs that will only be on the market for a short time because of the black box warning and removing them from the market.
Yeah, and they don't understand the real harms and benefits of those medications.
Exactly. So can you trust the FDA? I don't think so. But what are you to do? I think we really need to change the paradigm from a disease care system to a healthcare system. And yet we've got a lot of disease out there, so we've got to do something, but we have to start someplace. We need to stop treating symptoms and start treating the causes for why people get sick in the first place. Then maybe we won't have to depend on the pharmaceutical and technology industries whose primary purpose is to make money for their investors. We won't have to invest into them or depend on them to keep us all healthy.